Elizabeth Warren told security to remove John Kennedy, then he did this. Under the blazing lights of a Boston convention center, Senator Elizabeth Warren stood tall at the podium, her voice slicing through the air like a well-sharpened blade, commanding the attention of a packed audience at a conference on financial reform. Her words rang out with the precision of a seasoned professor, each syllable deliberate, as she laid bare the inequities of the banking system. We need a financial system that works for the people, not one that exploits them for the benefit of corporate giants. She declared, her voice rising to meet the swell of applause that erupted from the crowd, a diverse mix of activists, local voters, and curious onlookers filling the cavernous hall. Cameras from CNN, NBC, and local news outlets swiveled to capture her every gesture, their lenses zeroing in on her as she leaned forward, her eyes alight with conviction. The audience, a sea of faces ranging from young students in hoodies to older folks in buttoned-up shirts, hung on her words, nodding along as she outlined a vision for a fairer economy. The energy in the room was electric, a shared sense of urgency pulsing through the crowd as Warren's speech hit its stride, her arguments weaving together data and passion in a way that made the complex issue of financial reform feel deeply personal. But just as the applause reached its peak, a murmur rippled through the crowd, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that drew eyes toward the press area near the side of the hall. A figure emerged, moving with a calm, almost leisurely stride that stood out against the charged energy of the moment. It was Senator John Neely Kennedy, his folksy Louisiana smile unmistakable, his slightly rumpled suit and easy demeanor a stark contrast to Warren's polished intensity. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of surprise and curiosity, as phones were raised to record the unexpected interruption. Kennedy, uninvited, and clearly not part of the program, stepped forward into the aisle, his presence like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of uncertainty through the room. Warren paused mid-sentence, her sharp eyes narrowing as she registered the intrusion. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice firm but laced with a controlled politeness that barely masked her irritation. "You're not on the program." A scattering of laughter broke out from one corner of the audience, mostly from Warren's supporters, who leaned forward in their seats, sensing a confrontation. But Kennedy, unfazed, raised a hand, not in defiance, but as if asking for a moment's patience, his smile never wavering. "Now hold on, Senator Warren," he said, his voice warm and drawling, carrying the cadence of a southern porch conversation. "I'm not here to make a fuss, but if we're talking about fairness in finance, don't I get a chance to say a word or two?" The crowd's reaction was immediate, a mix of gasps and murmurs, some shouting, "Get him out!" while others, intrigued, called out, "Let him speak!" The tension was palpable. A tightrope stretched across the hall as eyes darted between Warren on the podium and Kennedy in the aisle. Warren, a veteran of political sparring, gripped the podium tightly, her knuckles whitening for a brief moment as she assessed the situation. She was no stranger to interruptions, having faced down hecklers and opponents in courtrooms and campaign trails, but Kennedy's bold move was something else, a calculated gamble that threatened to derail her carefully orchestrated event. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady but sharp as a tack. "Senator, this is a forum for solutions, not for uninvited guests to take the stage," she said, her words drawing a wave of applause from the left side of the room where her supporters clustered their signs and buttons proclaiming their allegiance. But the mood in the hall was shifting, a current of curiosity running through the audience like a low hum. Kennedy, standing his ground, didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly as if weighing her words, then let out a soft chuckle that echoed through the speakers, disarming in its simplicity. "I reckon I'm not on the guest list," he said, his eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and sincerity. but I've never been one to leave a conversation quietly, especially when it's about something as important as this." The crowd buzzed, a mix of laughter and groans as phones continued to record, their screens glowing in the dim light. A middle-aged woman in a red scarf in the middle rows stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. "Let him talk." She shouted her words, prompting a smattering of cheers from others who were caught up in the drama. But a group closer to the stage, loyal to Warren, countered with shouts of, "Get out!" The noise swelled, a chaotic symphony of support and dissent, threatening to drown out the proceedings. Warren signaled to the security team, two men in sleek black suits, who moved swiftly toward Kennedy, their steps purposeful but cautious, as if unsure how to handle a senator in this unorthodox situation. Kennedy, still standing in the aisle, his face lined with the wrinkles of a seasoned politician, wore a gentle smile that suggested he'd faced far tenser moments than this. He raised both hands, not in surrender, but as if asking the world to pause for a second, his voice cutting through the din with surprising clarity. "Hold on, folks," he said, his tone as warm and steady as if he were chatting with neighbors over a fence. "I'm not here to disrupt, but if we're talking about fixing a system that's supposed to serve everybody, don't I get a say too?" The crowd's reaction was immediate, a mix of chuckles and whistles, some in protest, others in encouragement. A man in a cowboy hat in the front row, his face weathered but animated, yelled, "Give him a chance." The call was echoed by a few others, their voices rising above the dissenters. Warren, still on the podium, her eyes narrowed, felt the shift in the room. She was used to commanding attention, but Kennedy's easy charm was like a magnet pulling the crowd's focus toward him. She leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting, like a lawyer preparing to cross-examine a witness. "Senator, this is a forum for serious solutions, not for stunts," she said, her words sharp enough to slice through the growing noise. "You're not on the program, and this isn't your playground." Her supporters clapped, their applause loud, but not overwhelming, as if part of the audience was holding its breath, waiting to see what Kennedy would do next. Kennedy, sensing the moment, took a small step forward, still keeping a respectful distance from the security team who hovered uncertainly nearby. His smile widened, not arrogant, but clever, as if he'd just thought of something worth sharing. "I don't need the whole stage, Senator Warren," he said, his voice soft, but carrying effortlessly, picked up by a nearby microphone. "Just 1 minute, that's all I'm asking. 1 minute to say what I think folks here need to hear." He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd, locking briefly with young and old skeptics and supporters alike, inviting them to lean in. "What do you all think is 1 minute too much to ask?" The room erupted into chaos, a cacophony of voices clashing like waves against a shore. A group of young activists in the back, their faces lit by the glow of their phones, shouted, "Let him speak." An older man in a checkered shirt stood up, his voice booming, "Give him a chance." But a cluster near the stage, clutching Warren's campaign pins, countered with, "No, get him out," reporters in the corner of the room typed furiously, their laptops glowing as they sensed a story that would dominate the evening news. A PBS camera zoomed in on Kennedy, capturing the way the stage lights caught his face, making him look almost like he'd planned this moment all along. The security team, caught between Warren's directive and the crowd's divided energy, hesitated, their eyes flicking between the senator in the aisle and the senator on the stage. Warren, feeling the weight of the crowd's shifting attention, knew that refusing Kennedy outright might backfire, painting her as unwilling to engage. She'd built her career on being a fighter, but also a listener, and she couldn't afford to seem afraid of dialogue. After a moment's pause, her mind racing through the implications, she nodded, her expression guarded but resolute. "Fine, Senator," she said, her voice icy but measured. 1 minute, but make it count. Don't waste our time. She stepped back slightly, her arms crossed, signaling the security team to stand down. The two guards froze, their posture tense as they watched Kennedy, who nodded in thanks, his smile unwavering. He took another small step, the stage lights hitting him perfectly, as if the universe had conspired to give him this moment. The crowd fell silent. Phones still raised their screens, a constellation of tiny lights in the dim hall. "Thank you," Senator Warren Kennedy said, his voice rich with sincerity, carrying the weight of someone who knew the power of a single moment. "I won't let you down." The air felt charged, every breath held, as the audience waited to see what John Neely Kennedy would say with his 1 minute a minute that could change the course of the entire event. The air in the Boston Convention Center crackled with tension as Senator John Neely Kennedy stood in the aisle, the stage lights casting an unintended spotlight on his unassuming figure. Senator Elizabeth Warren on the podium, her arms crossed and her gaze sharp, had just reluctantly granted him 1 minute to speak a decision that could either diffuse the brewing storm or hand Kennedy the stage entirely. The crowd, a vibrant mix of activists, local voters, and media, leaned forward, their phones still raised, capturing every second of this unexpected showdown. News cameras from CNN and NBC swiveled between Warren's steely composure and Kennedy's folksy calm, sensing a moment that could dominate headlines. The room was a tinderbox ready to ignite as Kennedy cleared his throat, his voice steady and warm, carrying the cadence of a Louisiana evening. "Thank you, Senator Warren, for giving me this minute." He began, his words rolling out like a gentle breeze, disarming in their simplicity. "I'm not here to steal the show or pick a fight. I just want to share something I learned back home, where folks could argue about everything, politics, football, even how to make a proper gumbo. But at the end of the day, they'd sit down together, break bread, and find a way to keep talking." He paused, his eyes sweeping the audience, connecting with a young woman in a hoodie, an older man in a tie, and a skeptical reporter in the corner, as if inviting each one into his story. A few in the crowd smiled, nodding instinctively, drawn in by his down-home charm. "This financial reform we're all talking about," he continued, his voice growing more serious. "It's something we all want. Fairness, opportunity, a system that doesn't crush the little guy. But fairness doesn't come from shouting louder or pushing someone out of the room. It comes from sitting down, listening, even when we don't see eye to eye." His words, plain but poignant, struck a chord. A woman in her 60s, clutching a notebook in the third row, nodded unconsciously, her expression softening. A young man in a T-shirt near the back whispered to his friend, "He's got a point," his voice tinged with surprise. The crowd's energy shifted, a ripple of curiosity and agreement spreading through the hall. Warren, still on the podium, sensed the change, her jaw tightening as she watched Kennedy weave his narrative. She kept her face composed, but inside she knew he was deftly pulling the audience toward him, his folksy sincerity a stark contrast to her razor-sharp precision. She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice cutting through the murmurs with a calm but pointed edge. "Thank you, Senator Kennedy, for your story," she said, choosing her words carefully like a chess player plotting her next move. "But we're here to talk about real solutions for financial reform, not porch-side anecdotes. People need action, not just words that make us feel good." Her words drew applause, particularly from her supporters on the left side of the room, where signs reading "Warren for the People" bobbed above the crowd. But the clapping was softer than Kennedy's reception, lacking the fervor that had greeted his opening lines. Warren knew she needed to reclaim the room, but Kennedy's presence lingered like a melody that wouldn't fade. Kennedy, still in the aisle, didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head, his smile subtle. but knowing as if he'd anticipated her counter. He didn't need to speak yet. His brief speech had already shifted the atmosphere, and the crowd's divided reactions told the story. A group in the back began chanting, "Kennedy, Kennedy," their voices rising in a rhythmic swell, while Warren's supporters near the stage countered with "Warren, Warren." The noise was a chaotic blend like a storm gathering strength. The security guards, still hovering nearby, exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to approach Kennedy or let the moment play out. A reporter from NBC, scribbling furiously in the press section, whispered to a colleague, "He just turned a bad spot into gold." The PBS camera zoomed in on Kennedy, capturing the way his calm demeanor seemed to anchor the room, even as the crowd's energy threatened to spill over. Kennedy raised a hand again, not to silence the crowd, but to steady it, his voice cutting through the noise with an effortless clarity. "Folks, I'm not here to argue with Senator Warren," he said, his tone as warm as a hearth fire. "She's right. We need a system that works for everybody. But I've learned something from the people back home, from farmers to shopkeepers to teachers. They don't want to fight. They want to be heard, respected, even when they don't agree. If we can't give each other a minute to listen, we're missing what makes this country work." His words landed like a well-aimed dart, simple yet resonant, and the applause that followed was louder, more unified, spilling across political divides. A man in a denim jacket in the middle rows stood up, his voice booming, "That's right. Let's listen to each other." Even some of Warren's supporters, caught off guard, clapped hesitantly, drawn in by the sincerity in Kennedy's voice. A young woman in glasses near the back turned to her friend, whispering, "I don't agree with him, but he's making sense." The room felt alive, a mix of cheers and murmurs, as phones continued to record, their screens flickering like fireflies in the dim light. Warren, sensing the crowd slipping toward Kennedy, stepped forward, her voice rising with a controlled intensity. "Senator, your call for listening is appreciated," she said, her tone measured but sharp, like a blade honed in the courtroom. "But the people I'm fighting for, working families, small business owners, communities crushed by predatory banks, they don't need more talk. They need a system that stops exploiting them. That's what this forum is about." Her words were met with a surge of applause from her base, a group of activists in the front rows standing to cheer, their energy fierce, but not enough to drown out the growing buzz around Kennedy. She locked eyes with him, her gaze unwavering, challenging him to respond without derailing her message. The crowd's division was clear, yet Kennedy's charisma was undeniably pulling more of them into his orbit. Kennedy, unfazed, took a small step forward, just enough to keep the light on his face, his smile steady but not smug. "Senator Warren," he said, his voice low and resonant, like a cello note lingering in the air, "I don't disagree with you. I've seen folks struggling on dirt roads in small towns where the banks don't care about them any more than you say. But reform doesn't happen by tearing each other down. It happens when we build a bridge, not a wall." He paused, letting the words sink in his eyes, scanning the crowd, drawing them in. "I'm not your opponent here. I'm just an American who believes we can do better by talking to each other." The crowd erupted again, the applause now thunderous, crossing party lines as even neutral audience members joined in. A man in a baseball cap, looking like he'd just come from a construction site, stood up shouting, "He's right. We need to talk." The moment felt like a turning point, the hall alive with a rare blend of reason and emotion, as if Kennedy had tapped into a deep, unspoken need for connection. Warren, her hands resting on the podium, felt the stage tilting toward Kennedy. She was no stranger to tough debates, but his ability to turn a confrontation into a conversation was a challenge she hadn't fully anticipated. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, but carrying a sharper edge. "Senator, I respect your perspective, but solutions don't come from defending a broken system," she said, her words slicing through the lingering applause. "We need change, real structural change, not just stories that make us feel good about talking." Her supporters rallied, their applause growing stronger. A young woman in a campaign T-shirt shouting, "That's right, Elizabeth, keep fighting." But the crowd's energy was split, and Kennedy's influence was undeniable. The security guards, still lingering at the edge of the stage, looked to Warren for direction, their uncertainty mirroring the room's divided mood. A CNN reporter in the corner typed rapidly, whispering to a colleague, "This isn't just a forum anymore. It's a live political showdown." The cameras stayed locked on both senators, capturing Warren's resolve and Kennedy's calm as the hall buzzed with anticipation for what would come next. The Boston Convention Center pulsed with a restless energy, the air thick with the aftershocks of Senator John Neely Kennedy's unexpected speech. His words, simple yet resonant, hung over the crowd like a melody that refused to fade, pulling even skeptical audience members into his orbit. Senator Elizabeth Warren, standing firm on the podium, her hands gripping the edges as if anchoring herself against the tide, felt the room's attention slipping. The stage lights, still inadvertently catching Kennedy in their glow, made him the focal point, his folksy charm and call for dialogue striking a nerve in a crowd hungry for connection in a divided world. Phones remained raised, their screens flickering as attendees recorded every moment, while news cameras from CNN, NBC, and PBS swiveled between Warren's steely resolve and Kennedy's unyielding calm. The crowd was a mosaic of reactions. Some clapped for Kennedy, others shouted for Warren, and a few sat in quiet contemplation, unsure where to land. Kennedy, sensing the moment's weight, stepped forward just enough to keep the light on his face, his smile warm but deliberate, like a storyteller who knew the power of a well-timed pause. "Senator Warren," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd navigated countless tense rooms, "I'm not here to dismiss the struggles you're fighting for. I've seen them myself, folks in small towns scraping by, let down by a system that's supposed to help them. But if we're going to fix it, we've got to start by listening not just to the people who agree with us, but to the ones who don't." His words landed softly, but with force, like a stone dropped into a still lake, sending ripples through the audience. A man in his 50s, wearing a faded flannel shirt, stood up in the middle rows, his voice cutting through the hum. "He's right. We need to talk, not fight." The applause that followed was scattered at first, but grew, pulling in even some of Warren's supporters, who couldn't help but nod at the sentiment. Warren. Her eyes locked on Kennedy, felt the crowd's energy tilting further toward him. She was no stranger to political theater, but his ability to turn a confrontation into a conversation was a masterclass in persuasion. She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice rising with a controlled intensity that carried the weight of her years as an advocate. "Senator Kennedy, I hear your call for listening, and I agree. Dialogue matters," she said, her tone measured but edged with urgency. "But the families I'm fighting for, single parents, small business owners, people drowning in debt because of predatory lenders, they don't have time for talk without action. They need a system that stops exploiting them, and that's what we're here to build." Her words sparked a surge of applause from her supporters, a group of activists in the front rows standing to cheer their signs waving like banners in a rally. A young woman in a blue jacket shouted, "Keep it real, Elizabeth." The clapping was fierce, but it couldn't fully drown out the lingering buzz around Kennedy, whose presence in the aisle felt like a gravitational pull. The crowd was split, a microcosm of the broader political divide, yet Kennedy's charisma was undeniably shifting the room's center. He raised a hand not to quiet the noise, but to steady it, his voice cutting through with a warmth that felt like a fireside chat. "Folks, I'm not saying we don't need action," he said, his drawl softening the edges of his words. "I've met people, truck drivers, teachers, folks running diners, who feel like the system's left them behind. They're not asking for a fight. They're asking for a chance to be heard. If we can't give each other that, how are we going to fix anything?" The crowd erupted again, the applause louder this time, crossing lines of ideology. A woman in a green sweater in the back rows stood clapping slowly, her face torn between admiration and hesitation. "He makes it sound so simple," she whispered to her friend, who nodded. Even a group of students originally there to support. Warren exchanged glances, one muttering, "I don't vote for his party." But he's got a point. The room felt alive, a swirling mix of cheers, murmurs, and the soft clicks of phone cameras capturing the moment. Warren, sensing the need to reclaim the narrative, leaned into the microphone, her voice sharp but composed, like a professor redirecting a wayward seminar. "Senator, your stories resonate because they're human. And I respect that," she said, her words carefully chosen to acknowledge his appeal without conceding ground. "But human stories alone won't fix a system that's rigged against the vulnerable. We need structural change regulations that hold banks accountable, protections for consumers, not just promises of better conversations." Her supporters rallied their applause, swelling a man in a union jacket shouting, "That's why we're here, Elizabeth." But the energy in the room remained divided, with Kennedy's call for unity still echoing in the minds of many. The security guards standing at the edge of the stage exchanged uncertain looks, their hands hovering near their radios, unsure whether to intervene, as the crowd's reactions grew louder. A reporter from CNN, typing furiously in the press section, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "This is more than a forum now. It's a battle for the room's soul." Kennedy, undeterred, took another small step, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, locking with audience members as if speaking to each one personally. "Senator Warren, I don't disagree that the system's got cracks," he said, his voice rising slightly, carrying a touch of passion. "I've seen those cracks in the faces of people who can't get a loan, who lose their homes because the rules favor the big shots. But if we only talk to the folks who already agree with us, we're just preaching to the choir. Real change starts when we sit down with the people on the other side." The crowd's response was immediate, a wave of applause that rolled through the hall, not just from his supporters, but from neutral attendees who felt the pull of his logic. A man in a baseball cap, his arms crossed, stood up, his voice booming, "Let's hear both sides." The sentiment caught on with others, nodding, their phones still recording as the moment gained momentum. Warren, her hands now resting lightly on the podium, knew she couldn't let Kennedy dominate the stage any longer. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the applause with a clarity that demanded attention. "Senator, I'm all for sitting down and talking, but when communities are being crushed by a system that prioritizes profit over people, we can't afford to wait for everyone to agree," she said, her tone fierce but controlled. "This forum is about solutions, specific actionable steps to protect consumers, not just feel-good calls for unity." Her words reignited her base, a group near the stage, standing to clap, their energy fierce and focused. A young man in a hoodie shouted, "Don't let him steal the show." Elizabeth, but the crowd's division persisted, with Kennedy's supporters chanting his name in the back, their voices clashing with Warren's in a chaotic symphony. The security team, still lingering, seemed frozen, their eyes darting between Warren's commanding presence and Kennedy's unshakable calm. Kennedy, sensing his minute was nearly up, raised his voice with a touch of humor, his eyes twinkling as he addressed the crowd directly. "Folks, I'm not here to say I've got all the answers," he said, his drawl wrapping around the words like a warm blanket. "But I've learned one thing: if we only listen to the people who think like us, we're stuck. I'm just asking for a chance to talk, not to win, not to lose, but to find a way forward together." The applause that followed was deafening, a surge of energy that seemed to lift the room, drawing in even those who'd been skeptical. A woman in her 30s holding a notebook turned to her friend and said, "I came for Warren, but he's making me think." The moment felt like a turning point, with Kennedy's words resonating beyond the hall, amplified by the phones and cameras, capturing every second. The reporters in the corner typed faster one from NBC, noting Kennedy's turning this into his stage. As the noise swelled, Warren signaled the sound crew to raise the background music, a subtle attempt to shift focus back to her agenda, but the crowd's energy was firmly in Kennedy's grasp, setting the stage for a moment that would soon explode beyond the convention center's walls. The Boston Convention Center buzzed with a restless energy, the echoes of Senator John Neely Kennedy's words still reverberating through the hall like a lingering chord. His brief, heartfelt call for dialogue had shifted the room's atmosphere, pulling the crowd, activists, voters, and reporters alike, into his orbit, with a magnetic blend of sincerity and Southern charm. Senator Elizabeth Warren, standing resolute on the podium, her hands resting lightly on the wooden surface, felt the weight of the moment. The stage lights, still catching Kennedy in their glow, made him the undeniable focal point, his unassuming presence commanding attention in a way that threatened to overshadow her carefully planned forum on financial reform. The audience was a kaleidoscope of reactions. Some chanted Kennedy's name, their voices rising from the back rows, while others clapped for Warren, their support fierce but struggling to match the swell of enthusiasm for Kennedy. Phones glowed in the dim light, capturing every second as news cameras from CNN, NBC, and PBS panned between Warren's determined expression and Kennedy's calm, knowing smile. The room felt like a powder keg ready to explode into something bigger, and Kennedy, sensing the moment's potential, stepped forward just enough to keep the light on his face. "Senator Warren," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying the warmth of a trusted friend. "I don't want to silence anybody's voice. I've seen the struggles you're talking about, folks losing their homes, their savings, because the system's stacked against them. But if we can't find a way to work together, the fairness you're fighting for will stay a dream. I'm ready to start today if you are." His words, simple yet weighty, landed like a spark in dry grass, igniting a roar of applause that swept through the hall. It wasn't just his supporters, conservatives in the back rows clapping with fervor, but neutral attendees, too caught up in his call for unity. A woman in a green sweater stood shouting, "Work together," her voice cutting through the noise. A group of students near the corner, originally there to back Warren, exchanged glances, one whispering, "He's got a point about talking." The applause grew a tidal wave of sound that seemed to lift the room, crossing political divides and amplifying Kennedy's influence. Warren, her eyes as locked on Kennedy, felt the stage tilting further in his favor. She was a seasoned fighter, used to holding her ground in debates and hearings, but Kennedy's ability to turn a confrontation into a conversation was a challenge unlike any she'd faced in this setting. She stepped to the microphone, her voice rising with a fierce resolve that demanded attention. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her tone sharp but controlled, like a lawyer delivering a closing argument. Sitting down to talk is a fine idea. But when communities, working, families, minority groups, people crushed by debt are dismissed or ignored, talk alone isn't enough. I'm here to demand justice, not to make everyone feel good about the status quo. Her words struck a chord with her base, a group of activists in the front rows leaping to their feet, clapping with a passion that echoed their commitment to her cause. A young man wearing a campaign pin shouted, "That's right, Elizabeth! Fight for us!" The applause was strong, but it couldn't fully drown out the chants of Kennedy, Kennedy from the back, a persistent rhythm that underscored the room's divided energy. Warren's supporters were unwavering, but Kennedy's appeal had tapped into a broader, almost primal need for connection, making the moment feel less like a policy forum and more like a live political theater. The security guards, still lingering at the edge of the stage, exchanged glances, their hands hovering near their radios, uncertain whether to act as the crowd's energy surged. A reporter from CNN, typing rapidly in the press section, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "Kennedy's turned this into his stage, but Warren's not backing down." The cameras stayed locked on both senators, capturing the contrast between Warren's fiery determination and Kennedy's understated charisma. Kennedy, sensing his time was nearly up, raised his voice with a touch of passion, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "Folks, I'm not here to say I've got all the answers," he said, his drawl wrapping around the words, amen words, like a comforting blanket. "But I've learned one thing in life: you don't fix a broken system by tearing each other apart. You do it by building bridges, finding common ground even when it's hard. That's what America's about." The applause was deafening, a storm of sound that seemed to shake the hall. A man in a denim jacket stood, his voice booming, "He's right. We need to work together." Even some of Warren's supporters clapped, caught up in the moment, their faces torn between loyalty and admiration. Warren, her hands now clenched on the podium, knew she had to act fast to reclaim the narrative. She leaned into the microphone, her voice ringing out with a clarity that cut through the noise. "Thank you, Senator Kennedy, for your perspective," she said, her words deliberate, her tone icy but professional. "But this forum is about action, specific measurable steps to fix a financial system that's failing millions of Americans. We're here to talk about solutions, not just unity." Her words drew a strong response from her supporters, a wave of applause rising from the front rows, but the energy in the room remained split, with Kennedy's influence still palpable. She signaled the sound crew, and soft background music began to play, a subtle attempt to shift the focus back to her agenda. But the crowd wasn't easily swayed. The chants of "Kennedy, Kennedy" grew louder, clashing with shouts of "Warren, Warren" in a chaotic symphony. A woman in her 40s holding a notebook turned to her friend and said, "I'm here for Warren, but he's stealing the show." The moment was slipping away, and Warren, though resolute, could feel it. As the applause for Kennedy continued, the storm spilled beyond the convention center. Within minutes, short video clips of his speech hit social media, posted by an account called Boston Beacon, with captions like, "Kennedy schools Warren on unity." The clips spread like wildfire, racking up thousands of views and likes within the hour. Comments flooded in praising Kennedy's sincerity. "This is how you debate with Class 1," user wrote. Another, claiming to be a Warren supporter, noted, "He's got a point, but she's right about action." News outlets jumped on the story. A local NBC affiliate ran a headline, "Kennedy turns Warren's forum into a lesson in dialogue." A PBS analysis called it a rare moment of real political connection, while a CNN commentator noted Kennedy turned a tense moment into a chance to connect, a smart move. Backstage in a small office, Warren sat with her team, a laptop screen glowing with the flood of social media posts. An aide, Sarah, scrolled through comments, her face tense. "They're calling him a hero of civility," she said, her voice low. Warren, in her navy blazer, stood and walked to the window, gazing at the bustling Boston streets. "I'm not chasing viral clips," she said, her voice firm but tinged with fatigue. "I'm here for the people who need reform, not for the spotlight." Sarah nodded, but her eyes stayed on the screen, where a new post read, "Kennedy won the room with heart." Meanwhile, Kennedy, in a black SUV leaving the venue, received a call from a colleague. "John, you just shook the nation," the colleague said, excitement in his voice. Kennedy leaned back, his smile faint. "I just said what I thought," he replied, his tone calm. "If folks want to listen, that's their choice." His aide, holding a phone, read aloud a YouTube comment, "Kennedy's the real deal, talks like a regular guy." On social media, a TikTok video spliced Kennedy's speech with text overlay, "When you're told to leave, but win the crowd." It hit tens of thousands of likes with comments like, "Southern charm for the win," and "Warren's tough, but Kennedy's got the room." The divide was clear, but Kennedy's appeal was dominating the online conversation. At a nearby coffee shop, audience members from the event gathered, debating heatedly. A man in a white shirt shared Kennedy's clip on his phone. "I came for Warren, but this guy's got me thinking," he said. His friend, a woman in glasses, shook her head. "Warren's right about the system, but Kennedy makes it feel possible to talk about it." A lesson for all. The clash between Kennedy and Warren at the Boston Convention Center was more than a political moment. It was a mirror reflecting America's deep desire for both change and connection. Kennedy, with his heartfelt call for dialogue, showed that sincerity and relatability can bridge divides even in a polarized world. His ability to turn a tense situation into a conversation tapped into a universal need to be heard and respected, reminding us that progress begins with listening. Warren, with her unwavering commitment to systemic reform, demonstrated the power of staying true to one's principles even when the spotlight shifts. Her focus on actionable solutions underscored the urgency of addressing real-world problems, not just talking about them. Together they offer a powerful lesson. Change requires both the courage to fight for justice and the humility to engage with those who disagree. In our own lives, whether at the dinner table, on social media, or in community discussions, giving someone a minute to speak, even when we differ, can spark understanding. Combining Kennedy's openness with Warren's resolve, we can build bridges toward a better future. Subscribe for more stories that inspire us to listen, act, and grow together.